Hello. Today I want to talk about freedom. Words are important. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the mantra of our republic. We've never quite attained to the ideal of these words. But there are about 4 words that have disappeared from our vocabulary in English that are centrally important to freedom. So in these times when freedom is in question, I thought a lecture that I gave my students would be a good time to talk about the 4 words that have disappeared from our vocabulary. So without further ado, here's my lecture on freedom, and I will come back afterwards and say a few things. So here we go. Hello, today I'd like to talk about freedom, or essentially the rhetoric of freedom. Freedom is a special idea. It's an idea that is age old, and yet the actuality or the ability to actually obtain freedom for people is pretty new, at least in the context of human history. Throughout most of history, work was done by slaves. Conquered people became slaves and did the work. And so it was easy to talk about, for the Greeks and Romans to talk about freedom. But 70% of the population were slaves. It's also true of the founding of the American Republic, where slavery in the South, of course, was the dominant method of labor, and certainly wasn't a lot of freedom for blacks. But it's the rhetoric of freedom that grows over time. It's these words of freedom, these ideas, ideals of freedom that are important, because over time the ideas of freedom grow and become actualized in the world. The ideas probably began in the Judeo-Christian rhetoric. Israel asked for a king. They were ruled by judges, kind of locally. There was a lot of freedom, but they wanted to be like everybody else and have a king. And those ideas from Judaism permeated through societies. The Christian ideals, freedom in Christ, stand fast therefore in the liberty wherein Christ has set you free, and be not entangled again in the yoke of bondage. The letters of the Apostle Paul all promoted these ideas of freedom. But it's really the British Isles that I mean, the Greeks talked about freedom. The Romans, predominantly Cicero, his writings talk about individual freedom. But it's not until all these ideals converge on the British Isles that we really begin to have a kind of organized political movements toward freedom. And of course, in 1215, the Magna Carta, 800 years ago, the first written document of freedom. This is an important year, 2015, the anniversary, the 800th anniversary. And essentially the British nobles were upset with King John, who was taxing them about 20% for his wars. And they finally had enough. I mean, who in the world would pay 20% taxes? And they forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, which is the first document that penned that kind of outlines our ideas of what freedom is all about. They essentially said you couldn't tax us, King John, because without our consent, you can't throw us in jail without charging us with something. John would throw nobles in jail and say, if you pay me this much money, I'll let you out, that kind of thing. And so, the first document of the ideas of freedom. Of course, the next most important document is, there's a lot of other writings that I'll talk about, but the next document that we think of is the Declaration of Independence. But in the rhetoric of freedom, there were 5 words that kind of dominate the discourse. They're in everybody's discourse. And 4 of those terms or those words have been lost in our culture, in our time. They're just gone. And so this lecture today is about those lost 4 terms of American freedom. And I'm primarily drawing from Oliver DeMille's famous lecture, The 4 Lost American Ideals. So let's go back to 1764. In 1764, John Adams was a teacher. He was content in being a teacher. He wrote about his love for the profession of being a teacher. He got to think, he got to study, he had students to teach, and then he could go home. And he got married to Abigail in 1764, and you can tell from his letters and his writings in this time period that all he wanted to do was have a nice quiet life as a scholar and a teacher. In 1764, George Washington was in debt, a businessman, land speculator, and in debt. And he spent 1764 trying to get out of debt. He wasn't particularly successful. Eventually he married Martha, who had come from a family of money, so kind of a gold digger. And George finally got out of debt. Thomas Jefferson was a college student, and he was brokenhearted. His girlfriend had just broken up with him. 20 years later, he would write about how brokenhearted he still was about this incident. His friend came to him to talk to him about it. Jefferson thought he was coming to console him, and his friend came and told him that he was going to marry Jefferson's girlfriend that had just broken up with him. Jefferson was crushed, and he eschewed romance for years after this. And he dedicated himself to his studies and to his mentor, George Witt, as a college student. And he buried himself in books. James Madison was 13 years old and a student. His teachers and his parents were worried about him because he was so introverted, because he was so quiet and reserved. He was an excellent student, but they wondered if he would ever amount to anything because he was so introverted. So the idea is, how did these guys, a decade later, sign away their lives and their fortunes when they signed the Declaration of Independence? What would cause these kinds of men that are a teacher, a businessman, a broken-hearted college student, and an introverted kid, what would cause them to commit high treason when they signed, to write the Declaration of Independence and then sign it and commit high treason and take on the most powerful Navy and Army and most powerful government in the world? I think it's just amazing that they did this. And what is it about these guys? I'm always taken aback by the term un-American. I mean, you can't be un-Irish. You can't be un-British. You can't be un-South African or un-Australian or un-Canadian. Those aren't terms that are in anybody's vocabulary, but un-American is. So it means something to be an American. And that's what I want to talk about today. Un-American certainly got a bad connotation to it in the 1950s with the Un-American Activities Committee. Is probably one of the most un-American committees ever formed. They were searching for communists under rocks and everywhere else. They made blacklists against Hollywood actors and writers and songwriters and musicians. I love Harry Truman's quote here, the most un-American thing in America. But the term un-American infers that there is some quality to being American. There's something about being an American that's different than being it's not about a geographic place. It's a term that refers to some kind of standard, some kind of ideals. And that's what I want to talk about, is what it really means, at least according to our founding fathers and the people that wrote the Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, and the ideas they drew from to create this idea that there is something called an American. Tocqueville, of course, wrote a great essay, very long essay, on what it means to be an American. But the first word I want to talk about is, and that's, excuse me, it's a word that's completely disappeared from our modern vocabulary, and yet it filled the early founding fathers' writings, especially Jefferson and Hamilton's writings as they debated. But the word means, it's an agricultural word. It comes from Virgil's, the Roman poet's poem, Georgics, a poem about farming. But the origin of the word geo means land, and then ergon, work, or to work the land, to be a farmer. Its first known use about 1720, and then it just skyrockets in use throughout the founding fathers' rhetoric. It's everywhere in their writings, and as you can see from this graph, that it just slowly disappears, or rather quickly disappears from public discourse. Has a little bit of a resurgent during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, and then disappears again. If we were to translate this word into modern terminologies, we'd probably say ownership. The idea that it's more than just farming is because it was an agricultural community or an agricultural society then. The idea is that somebody who works the land, they have their own farm, they're independent, they can't be bought, they grow their own food, they have their own animals, they're self-sustaining. Georgic ownership. They own their own property. Property was an important concept. John Locke, in his writings, that Jefferson, of course, drew from, life, liberty, and property. It was Jefferson that changed it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But in Locke's writings, it was about property. And you had to be an owner in order to be independent. In Jefferson and Hamilton's debate about what kind of government we should have, they both agreed with Montesquieu's, the French lawyer, French philosopher, writings about what kind of political structures there were. It was Montesquieu that came up with this idea of the separation of powers, that the executive branch has a certain power. In that respect, it's really guns and police power. The legislative branch has the ability of money. They're the ones that control the money and who gets the money. And the judicial branch has law. And that these different powers need to have checks and balances on their power, and that the power in any society needs to be separated. And Montesquieu about three types of governments. There are monarchies, or governments headed by one particular figure, a king or an emperor, the queen, and they rely primarily on the principle of honor, the idea of ownership. Despotisms. This is the kind of government that Niccolo Machiavelli wrote about in his book The Prince in the 1300s. Machiavelli wrote that it's better to be feared than loved, that your people, it's kind of like a handbook on how to be king. If your people love you one day, but then they run out of bread, they'll hate you the next. You can't control love, but you can control fear. And so despotic governments rule by fear, dictatorships, that kind of thing. And then there are republics, free governments headed by popularly elected officials. They might have a king, but they also have, for example, in Britain, a parliament that are elected. And they rely on the principle of public virtue, or the good of society. So Montesquieu said that most societies have a kind of cultural purpose. Warfare societies, which would be generally despotic kind of governments or monarchies, but warfare societies love war. Sparta in Greece, warfare society where being a warrior is the highest honor, that you get a glory from in war, that war is glorious. We might have the idea that they use warfare to gain wealth, but the real goal of a warfare kind of society is that they use wealth to engage in war. And it's all about honor, honor in battle. In science fiction, of course, the Klingons are the epitome of a warfare society. There are religious societies, Montesquieu said. The problem with religious societies, he thought, were they become kind of oppressive. They become fundamentalist. The idea that our religion is the only religion that's right, and you need to be one of us. The Spanish Inquisition, a good example of a religious society that was Christian. Today we think of the Taliban or something like that, the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, that kind of. And so the founding fathers of our government, they didn't want those kinds of societies. They decided we should have a commercial society. Commercial societies are based on prosperity, public prosperity, the idea that everybody should be in the free market kind of thing, a commercial society. And so they designed a republic, that was based in commerce, or a commercial republic is what they decided was the kind of government that they wanted. Montesquieu is the most quoted person in the Constitutional Convention. But in the commerce debate, both Hamilton and Jefferson had different ideas. Hamilton wanted a country based in manufacturing. He wanted, large factories. He wanted the elite to be in charge of the country. He even argued that George Washington should be king. And the idea is a nation of employees. Hamilton didn't like the idea of democracy at all. Not many of the founding fathers did. They saw democracy as tyranny of the majority. Jefferson, probably the most dedicated to the idea that the people could govern themselves. But Hamilton didn't think people could govern themselves. He wanted a strong federal government. He wanted large manufacturers and commerce as the commercial foundation, and people could be employees. Excuse me. And so the idea was that employees can be controlled. Jefferson, on the other hand, saw a more agrarian society. This is where the word Georgics comes in over and over again. He wanted people who were individual owners, small shopkeepers and farmers, people who worked the land. They could provide for themselves. They were independent. They couldn't be bought. They would be good citizens. Because they were independent, they were owners. And so Georgics, in our modern language, would be ownership. It wasn't just agrarian for Jefferson. I mean, he had a nail factory at Monticello. But the idea was small business owners, not large business, but small business owners, shopkeepers, people who were in charge and owned their own livelihood. Georgics. The word over time has, of course, disappeared, and the idea of ownership has disappeared. In 1800, 90% of the people in the North were owners. Of course, in the South, so many were slaves, and that's the great hypocrisy of the American Revolution and documents. Is the idea of slavery. The southern colonies wouldn't allow the paragraphs Jefferson had written about slavery into the Declaration of Independence. They axed them out. It's a wonderful read to read Jefferson's draft of the Declaration before it got edited. But 90% of the northern colonies were owners, and Georgics was an important idea. By 1900, 90% of the general population of America were owners of businesses, owners of farms. We were still primarily an agrarian society at that time. The Industrial Revolution, of course, was exploding, and we were getting to have more and more employees. but at least legally slavery was outlawed after the Civil War, and we started to have organizations like the National Negro Business League, where we had black business owners, even though the Jim Crow laws put many blacks in the South back into slavery, and the northern ghettos weren't a great place either. But by the year 2000, only 10%, less than 10% of the American population in general were owners of businesses and farms and that kind of thing. We're a nation now of employees. And so I guess Hamilton's position has won over the last couple hundred years, and Jefferson's hasn't. And George X is a word that's just completely disappeared from our vocabulary. The next word, besides freedom and George X, that you see in their writing, providence. And providence, as you can see from this graph, has also continually disappeared from our vocabulary. This word it fills the writings of the American founding fathers, and it's more than just the idea that there's a God. Providence is the idea that not only is there a creator, but they're in charge. He or she is in charge of what happens. Providence is a little bit like fatalistic. It's the creator is in charge. They're in charge of you personally. That the providence has this idea that you have a specific purpose in your personal life that's been given to you by God, and that the nation has a purpose that should be pursued, that's given to them by God. Just totally gone from our language, and yet this word fills the American record of the founding fathers. Adam said there's no such thing as human wisdom, all is the providence of God. And even Jefferson, who some of the founding fathers called him an unbeliever. Jefferson wrote his own Bible that took out all the miracles of Jesus. It's the idea of deist, that God starts the thing and it runs like a clock. But even Jefferson writes about the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, which is exactly what they did when they signed that declaration. So in these forgers of the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, they and in Montesquieu's writings, in Locke's writings, the idea that there's a divine creator and he gives inalienable rights to man, and the only purpose of government is to secure those rights that are not given by the king, but rights that are given to each individual human by God. And government's only purpose is to protect those rights. The next word that's lost, besides George X and providence, is liber. It's the root word of liberty. It's the root word of library. And those two go together, because the idea that liberty can only be obtained through education. And liber was the kind of education that these founding fathers talked about. It's amazing As you know, today when we try to read the Federalist Papers, and as you read them, you realize you struggle to read them because of the language, the long sentences, the the words, and then to realize that these were newspaper articles that the common everyday people read. I mean, that was the level of education in colonial America. A liber education. The word in Latin means tree bark. The idea was that liber was somebody who could write a contract and that kind of thing. And of course they wrote on papyrus and paper that made from tree bark, and so that's where the word originates, and it's that entrenched that somehow a liber or liberal education is important for a republic to survive. In Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European, the word means to grow. Old Latin lober, the god of growth, if you will. And so this idea of freedom and growth, or liberty and library. You gotta be educated to have freedom. Freedom can't exist without educated people. So, contrary to our modern conception of education, the founders didn't mean job training. What they thought of as an education was a classical liberal education, something to teach people how to think, but not what to think. So even in today's world, we have three types of education, and you can see these types of education clearly. An employee education is that's the kind of education where there are textbooks, it's standardized, everybody learns the same thing. Even in Rome and Greece, slaves could be educated. They could be able to read and write. They were literate, and that's what an employee education is all about. It's an education so that you can read and write and be kind of qualified to get a job. The equivalent, I suppose, in our culture is a high school education, standardized testing, that kind of thing will teach you what to think. Then you get to college, and you go into workforce development, and those kinds of terms appear. And it's a professional education. Science and math dominates in both these educations now. These types of education. So you're going to become a professional, a doctor, or dental hygiene. All of these career kind of education programs. But a liber education, a liberal education, is what, in that article I had you read at the start of the semester, Bill Cronin's Only Connect, the freedom to grow, those 10 characteristics of somebody who has a liberal education. They can read, they can write clearly, persuasively, and movingly. They know how to get things done in the world. It's a classical education. It's a lifetime education. It's something that you're constantly involved in. You're reading. You go to the library. You're writing. You know the classics. You know Plato. You know Aristotle. You've read Shakespeare. You've read your Bible. You understand the classics. You understand the thinking. And so we have signs around campus. Mesa Community College students are critical thinkers. I saw one down in the Palo Verde lobby of the Palo Verde building. A liberal education is richer. It's something that you continue for your whole life. And this idea of liber is disappearing from our vocabulary. We don't understand where the word liberal education comes from, and it's even starting to get a bad name. Well, that liberal education. But that's important. It's important to freedom. You can't have free people that aren't educated. That, you know, you need people who read in depth and understand what they read. And then virtue, the fourth word. Georgex has disappeared. Providence has disappeared. Liberal education we're barely hanging on to. And this idea of public virtue, I think, is almost non-existent. Adams wrote, when public virtue is gone, when the national spirit is fled, the republic is lost in essence, though it may still exist in form. And in a lot of ways, I think that's where we are today. Montesquieu wrote, a necessary condition for the existence of a republican government, whether democratic or aristocratic, is that the people in whom supreme power is lodged possess the quality of public virtue, meaning that they are motivated by a desire to achieve the public good. And that's what these guys exhibited when they signed that Declaration of Independence, when they committed treason against their government because of what they believed to be true was more important than their own personal positions and their own lives. They'd found something that they thought was worth dying for. Public virtue has sacrifice attached to it. The idea that you'll sacrifice yourself for public good. Probably George Washington is one of the best examples of public virtue of the Founding Fathers. He didn't want to be president. It was the last thing he wanted. He was essentially forced into it by his peers. He wrote, it's the greatest sacrifice of my personal feelings and wishes that I've ever been called upon to make, which is a pretty powerful statement because during the Revolutionary War, he finally had a camp at one time that was pretty close to Mount Vernon. So he got on his horse and he was going to ride to Mount Vernon to see Martha. He hadn't seen her in 7 years. He hadn't been home in 7 years. And as he's riding out of camp, he heard some soldiers who their terms were like 1 and 2 years in the service. And he heard some soldiers saying, well, you know, the general can go home and see his wife, but we can't. And he turned his horse around and went back to his tent, even though he hadn't seen Martha for 7 years. He sacrificed that for the good of his men, so that he could set an example for them. Public virtue, the signing of that document, the Declaration of Independence, giving up his idea that finally this damn war is over, I can go home to Martha and be with her, and then accepting the job of President of the United States. Sacrifice, public sacrifice for the good of people. Well, that's the rhetoric of liberty. These 5 words fill the writings of our founding fathers. They are the foundation ideals of what our government was supposed to be. And 4 of them have disappeared from our vocabulary. And if we lose them completely, we lose our freedom. Freedom is a precious gift. And freedom is promoted and produced by or through public speaking. It's that avenue of public discourse that keeps liberty and freedom alive. And so I want to encourage you as public speakers to make sure that it's not just about college and career. It's not just about giving a good presentation in college or selling Cadillacs. That that public speaking recognize that it's about preserving the liberty that has been purchased for us by our forefathers who shed their blood for our freedom. And so I leave you with Thomas Jefferson. A quote: "Rightful liberty is unobstructed action, according to our will, within limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others." And so essentially in that sentence he's saying that liberty, our individual liberty, is tied to everybody else's liberty. And we're all in this together. And then he writes, and I do not add, within the limits of the law. Because the law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of the individual. And so it's individual freedom that these guys gave their lives for, that they committed treason and took on the most powerful government and military in their world to create this amazing thing we call the United States of America. It's an amazing experiment that's only just not even 300 years old yet. This wonderful experiment in individual liberty. Something never been tried before in the history, that within 80 years of its founding ended up in a civil war because they didn't deal with slavery and other economic issues. That the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s and Dr. King's speeches were all about, and bringing this rhetoric back to life. And we need all five of these words in order to preserve our liberty. We need citizens who are owners, that are independent, that are out of debt, that dedicate their lives to public good, that have decided to be a force for good, that are educated and understand how to get things done in the world and make connections. That's what our republic is founded on, and that's what we need in order to preserve it, and we're not doing a very good job of preserving it. I'll see you in class, but I'll have another lecture for you next week. Please use your public speaking skills for good. Thanks.
If we're going to make America great again, it's words like this that need to be spoken. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherein Christ has set you free, and be not entangled again in the yoke of bondage. See you next time.
Adios.